What's up, guys? Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and in this video we are going to be covering Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, Common Sense Guide to the Economy. And in this book he just gives a reasonable and rational view of how the economy works. He only uses words, there are no graphs, and what I'm going to attempt to do is go through it chapter by chapter and give you a brief summary of all the points that he makes. Of course, there are a myriad of examples that he will give and a lot more information if you read the book yourself, but I'm just trying to give you a more compressed version so you can understand the economy at a basic level. So that's what we're going to do, and let's get right into it. All right, chapter 1, what is economics? Now there's really only one concept that you need to get in your mind to understand how to think economically, and it's allocation of scarce resources that have alternative uses. So when you're talking about scarcity, it is not a physical lack of a resource, but it has to do with the relationship between limited resources and the unlimited wants and desires of the public. So the public desires way more than what society could possibly provide. So they want this and that. But when speaking economically, it is either this or that. And then when you make that decision, how does that affect pricing? How does that affect demand, supply, production, all of that? And then there's the economic systems that are responsible for allocating those resources. And we're going to go into how those are efficient or inefficient in doing so. Also, economics is cause and effect. Incentives that choices create rather than the goals that they pursue. This is a common theme that Thomas Sowell brings up. Basically, economic analysis versus political rhetoric. There are politicians that will bring up goals, but are those goals going to bring the economic prosperity, or is it going to be just all talk? Chapter 2 is the role of prices. Now we're going to discuss two types of economies, the first being a free market economy, where the production and prices are determined by unrestricted competition between individuals and businesses, not central planners of government. Now, a common myth that people think is true about free market economies is that high prices equals the greed of the wealthy. This is simply not true. Prices are determined by competition and the laws of supply and demand. If companies set their prices randomly or at a super high price, then they would be losing competition. They would be losing business to other people that could provide the same quality at a lower price. So the second type of economy is a command economy, with socialism and communism being examples of such. And this is where there's bureaucracy by fiat or authoritative decree, which would have to determine the cost of goods individually if it were not for prices. So in this type of system, the government determines all the prices, and the economy doesn't function on its own through free competition. Now, I'm no expert of socialism or communism, but socialism was a theory proposed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and it was meant to propose public ownership of all goods in a stateless society, and socialism being an intermediary step to a fully realized communist state, or a communist system. So basically, people have utilized his theory, but the problem is that the power distribution gets misaligned. So In a communist state, the government will hold all the power and determine all the prices, determine all the means of production, where I believe the theory proposed there would be no political system to run anything. It would just be community ownership, with the community determining the means of production, which is extremely difficult only unless you have a very small society. So the problem with command economies is the government will hold too much power, and the problem with capitalist economies is that private individuals will hold too much wealth. Another point worth mentioning is that it is actually rare for a country to be fully capitalist or fully socialist. Like, a lot of people think the US is fully capitalist, but we actually have elements of socialism as well, which makes us a mixed economy. For example, USPS is a mail service that is government run, and we also have private institutions such as Amazon, UPS, and FedEx that provide the same mail delivery service through free competition. And yeah, so the two can work hand in hand. It's just about determining which one should be government run and which one should be run through free competition and private individuals. Okay, the next point is there is no fixed supply of resources. The example being oil. A lot of people like to be alarmist and say that we are running out of oil. In reality, there's only a fixed supply in circulation. So there's an indefinite amount of resource that the earth can provide that we are not aware of. It's just very costly to explore for these resources. And the way that price works with supply and demand is quantity supplied will vary directly with the price, meaning the higher the price goes, the more incentive that people have to supply, or the more incentive that people have to explore for oil or resource. And then the higher the price goes, then the demand will vary indirectly, meaning that it will lower, and then the lower demand will eventually lower the price. And then it's just cyclic, in this cyclic motion constantly. And then moving on to the next point, costs are foregone opportunities, and there will always be unmet needs that politicians preach. Just going along with the common theme, politicians will always have political bias, but economics will be analytical and consequential, and will understand the implications of their decisions after the fact when they are made. Chapter 3 is price controls. Now, we went over in Chapter 2 how prices are affected by supply and demand. As more is demanded and less is supplied, then the prices will rise. As more is supplied and less is demanded, then the prices will fall. Now we're going to look at how price controls by the government affect these laws of supply and demand, and what essentially happens as a consequence. So a price ceiling is when prices are kept artificially lower, so keeping a price at a certain point from rising to a certain point. And what basically happens is that as you keep the prices lower, the demand will go higher, which will result in people hoarding the product. They will buy it up, and then as people buy it up, there's going to be no supply, so this will result in the creation of black markets to sell the product, and also the deterioration in quality. Now, deterioration in quality is more so for the examples I'll give in a second, with housing and with medical care. Okay, so a price floor will have the opposite effect as a price ceiling. So instead of keeping prices artificially lower, prices will be kept artificially higher. Now, what does this mean? When prices are kept from decreasing to the level that they would through supply and demand, then the demand will be lower, and this will result in the supply being higher and a surplus being created. So there will be more available than what will actually be bought up. Moving on to some examples of price controls in action. So Thomas Sowell uses the example of rent and of medical treatment to outline how a price ceiling would work. And basically what happens when you put a cap on rent or put a cap on medical service, what happens is the demand for those things goes very high, or that is the expected consequence of such. So the intended goal is to lower the price or keep the price lower so more people can afford it, and there will be easier access for the general public. But Sowell argues for the opposite side, saying that it will be hard to determine whether the people who actually need the housing or who actually need the medical care will get it, because it will be a first come, first serve when it comes to rent, and there will be a lot more people waiting when it comes to medical service. So he also mentions that landlords will have less incentive to upkeep the apartments because the endeavor to use affordable housing will be a lot less lucrative, and this might move to the construction of luxury housing as opposed to affordable housing as well. On the opposite end, Sowell examines how price floors work in action. So in this case, the intention of setting a price floor for farmers or for local businesses would be that if they're not selling enough product, at least they could sell the same amount of product but at a higher set price, so they would in turn make more money. So this is the intended purpose of setting a price floor, but Sowell argues that when you keep prices from dropping to where they would normally go through the laws of supply and demand, then this would cause a surplus and also lower the demand to buy up their products in the first place, which in turn will grant more business to the agricultural corporations who can provide us with products at a cheaper price. Chapter 4 is an overview of prices. So just to go over briefly what we discussed in part 1, systematic causation. Economics is cause and effect. It involves complex reciprocal interactions between buyers, sellers, the government, and the environment. So with all these complex interactions going on, that is what will determine the prices of everything within the market. And a point about rationality, the myth of stupid bureaucrats. We're always saying, why are they making those dumbass decisions? But Thomas Sowell says that people act rationally or in self-interest. So if a politician is acting within their own self-interest, it might be opposing to your self-interest, which is why you will say that they are being stupid or acting stupidly. And incentives, we have been discussing incentives. This is something that motivates behavior in a certain way. So people will have incentive to behave in a certain way depending on the pricing or laws in place, right? So incremental substitution is the principle that economics works on. Or basically, you can't have your cake and eat it too. But when you're a politician, you will say you can have your cake and eat it too. We can outline the goals, and these goals are exactly what's going to happen. But we cannot have pros without cons. There will always be consequences, whether good or bad, from the decisions that are made in society. And we have to analyze the effect that this has on the economy as a whole. And just to give some brief definitions, a subsidy is a payment to individuals or firms from government to make something cheaper, and a tax is a charge collected from individuals or businesses to fund government services, goods, and activities. And we are all well aware of the implications that taxes have on all of us. So, price controls and subsidies reduce incentive for inherent self-rationing, and I would assume if we were taxed to an enormous degree, that this would improve the incentive for inherent self-rationing. But none of us would want that, of course. Chapter 5 is the rise and fall of businesses. So businesses operate on profits and losses. 1/3 or 33% of all businesses fail to survive for 2 years, so around 67% do survive. 1/2, I made a typo here, it's not 1/4. 1/2 or over 50% fail to survive for 4 years, and 35% survive for 10 years. So, as you could see, it's a very tough business, pun intended, and adaptability to changing conditions is what builds successful businesses. So, a business's ability to adapt to certain changes, whether it be social, economic, technological, or within business leadership or management, will affect how long the business is determined to keep running. Now, I do not own a business, nor do I claim to be an authority within business matters, but this information may be useful to people who have one or are looking to start one. So the first change you need to look out for is a social one, which is concerning knowledge and insight of the behavior of consumers. Urbanization being one, as people move from rural to more condensed urban areas. Then the location of where you place your business becomes increasingly important. Also, the creation of the automobile for transportation. This is also a technological change that occurred that changes how society moves drastically. And if your business is closer, or if your business is easier to get transportation to, then you will probably have a competitive advantage over your rivals. So that's the point. The businesses that provide the product most efficiently will make the most profit, lower cost, and be able to sell at lower prices at a competitive advantage. Now, another good example of a social change that occurred recently, or semi-recently, was in 2020 when the coronavirus came around and there was a high demand for non-perishable foods, toilet paper, and hand sanitizer. So the businesses that saw this social change and were able to react to it most efficiently will gain a competitive advantage and probably profited the most. The next adaptation is economic, so changes within the economy, mostly concerning banks and the management of firms. So, introduction of credit cards in the 1960s being an example, and the businesses that accepted them as payment would profit the most. We could see even more recently that everybody uses their phones to pay with Apple Pay or some other card service provider. And if you are a business and you aren't providing this service, then you will definitely lose out on profit. The next adaptation is technological. Improvement in machinery or equipment, TVs to flat screens, smartphone with a camera to replace digital cameras, and company expansion into new tech to keep the company alive. So if your company sells cameras only, you will probably lose out to a business that sells the same cameras and as well as TVs, computers, etc. The last change we're going to talk about is through business leadership. So personalities and methods of management that change over time. New management or keeping old leaders stuck in their methods could be beneficial or detrimental in relation to other changes, social, economic, and technological. To give an example of this, Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple, or the previous CEO of Apple, was a huge personality for the company, and he brought a lot of attention to the iPhone and the iPod and all of the Apple products. And in 2007, the iPhone and iPod Touch were released and basically brought a computer in the form of a smartphone to your pocket. So, of course, Steve Jobs, as an individual, cannot do everything on his own, but you could see the value of having an innovative and a very attention-drawing personality such as himself. You could see this in the current time with Elon Musk as well. He draws a lot of attention. He has his companies, and I'm sure they work hand in hand when achieving profit. Chapter 6 is the role of profits and losses. So when we think of profit, we might think that when we buy something, that the company is pocketing that profit from the sales made. But in reality, a profit is not a surplus value. It is the revenues of those sales minus the costs and expenses that the business would put into their products. So capitalism's cost is profit for the individuals or private corporations, and socialism's is inefficiency, meaning that the economy is not allowed to function on its own because of government intervention. Profit rates from 1960 to 2005 on average range from 4.1% to 12.4% before taxes and 2.2% to 7.8% after. Now, when we're talking about economies of scale, it means proportionate saving in costs gained by increased production. And where the increased production comes from is the higher margin of profits that a business would make. So the profits can't just be pocketed. They need to be funneled back into the business to make it better and also to keep it alive. When there's a diseconomy of scale and a business is just getting by, let's say, and everyone pockets the profits, the executives, then that business is probably not destined to be around for so much longer. To give an example, not really of a pure business, but of a method used by Mr. Beast, the YouTuber, he put all his money from his previous videos into the next videos. So all the money he would make from one video, he would funnel it right into the next video. And it is a high risk, high reward scenario, but it is the perfect way to increase your production, like how much he can scale up, right? You could see that his videos are on an enormous scale now, just because he puts everything that he makes back into his work. So this is a good example, not necessarily of pure business, but just how you can envision it. Moving on to cost and capacity. So costs vary to the extent to which existing capacity is being used, as capacity is usually built to handle the max volume of production, with cruise ships being a good example. So I don't know if you guys saw that video where there was one person on the cruise ship and they have everybody working there. They have everything being produced to the level as if they had full capacity. So if you have not too many people on the ship, they're still going to be putting in the same amount of resources regardless. So whatever's not being used is going to be incurred as a cost. Also, if you have these types of costs that are occurring because of a lack of profit, then the business owner may be forced to cut labor or cut capital, cut certain resources that they throw into their business, and this in turn will lower the scale that they can operate at. So, all right, moving on. Additional costs from market changes cannot be passed on into higher prices for consumers because of competition. Right, so that's just what we've been talking about. You cannot arbitrarily set the prices of goods because of free competition. Do not cut out the middleman. They exist as intermediaries between producers and consumers because they conduct their operations more efficiently. A good example of a middleman would be like Walmart or Target or any company or any business that sells other businesses' products. So if you're, let's say, Apple, and you're only selling Apple products within the Apple Store, you're going to be getting a whole lot less profit than if you sold it at all the cell phone companies, which they do, or within Walmart or Target or any other middleman that can sell the product as well. So yeah, that's why you do not cut out the middleman. Last point, socialist, centrally planned economy. Inefficient allocation of resources leading to costly inventories, low quality goods due to lack of innovation, and higher costs of production. So overall, just Thomas Sowell says that a socialist economy is not very productive because we cannot just randomly choose the prices for goods. They should be left up to the free market because you will get a higher inventory that is not being used. The costs of production will go higher and the quality of goods will go down. Real quick, I just want to apologize to you guys if the text is too small or too closely spaced together. I do not want to change it now because I'm far too lazy, but in the future, I will definitely make it easier for you to read whenever I'm making presentations. So, Chapter 7 is the economics of big business. A corporation is a separate legal identity that protects owners from potential liability. So, a limited liability company or a corporation. The main difference between an LLC and a corporation is that an LLC will be owned by one or a few individuals, and a corporation will be owned by the stockholders or shareholders. So stockholders can hold shares of a company that will grant them partial ownership with only the liability of their share. So if a company goes under, then all they would lose is their share within that company. And what this does is allow for larger scale businesses. It allows people to pool more resources into the company and increase the level of production. So the good thing about corporations is that if your business goes under, only your corporation's assets in themselves can be seized by creditors and not your personal assets. If an owner wants to pool his own personal resources into the company to save it from going out of business, then this will become a corporation asset. Corporate governance, the hierarchy of management. So there are executives that manage the company, and they are employed by a board of directors who own the company and hold the ultimate authority in making business decisions. And there are also stockholders who hold ownership minus the responsibility of control. Just to give some quick definitions, a monopoly is when there's only one seller in the market. So if a government had control over the production of a certain product, they would have a monopoly on that market. Also, if a private business, let's say Dunkin' Donuts, sold donuts and they controlled all the production of donuts. Then they would have a monopoly on the donut market because nobody else is selling them. And oligarchy is similar, except a small number of sellers control the market, and a cartel is the formal version of an oligarchy, and the prices and output are set by the people who run it. And the last point, just reiterating what we've been saying, free competition will allow for prices to reflect consumer needs. So when there's little competition, too little people hold power and are able to set prices arbitrarily, and free competition will be able to reflect the needs of the people. Chapter 8 is regulation and antitrust laws. So this chapter is all about monopolies and what happens in response to their formation. So the Interstate Commerce Commission was formed in 1887, and this is a regulatory commission or a government agency that sets and enforces standards for pricing for a specific economic sector, which results in inefficiency and poor pricing. This commission was created in response to monopolies being formed in the railroad system. So Cornelius Vanderbilt was an example of this, and then there's also J.D. Rockefeller, who had a monopoly on the oil industry. So along with this, antitrust laws are created by the government, which are designed to protect consumers from predatory business practices, prevent monopolies, and ensure competition. Competition being a market condition in which many firms compete for consumers and many could dominate or be eliminated in the market. The tricky business being that it is difficult to differentiate between a person who has a monopoly and control over the market and a business that just makes a lot of sales genuinely. So control the market is a flawed idea that a company's percentage of sales in a given market describes how much control it has over that market. So in today's era, this is difficult to determine. Let's say Microsoft or Apple has a large percentage of the sales within the technological division. This does not necessarily mean that they have control over the market. It just means that they are making more sales than their competition. Predatory pricing is another unsubstantiated theory in which a company riskily takes losses by selling below cost to drive out competition. So the idea behind this back in the day, let's say Cornelius Vanderbilt had control over the railroad transportation and J.D. Rockefeller had control over the oil industry. If you have control over a large percentage of the market, you can set your prices lower. What this will do is force your competition who's trying to get into the market to either sell their business to you or set their prices lower and then eventually be driven out of business. So this idea may be true for monopolies back in the day, but for companies nowadays, it is just a byproduct of the efficiency that they provide. Chapter 9 is market and non-market economies. So profit and non-profit industries intertwine and interchange. We talked about this before with the U.S. being a mixed economy with elements of capitalism and socialism. So the non-profit government sector would be like colleges, foundations, hospitals, museums, but all these things could also be private institutions as well. Government-run institutions are mainly monopolies. So yeah, the government runs all means of production, and in socialism, they run all means of production in every market. Profit organizations have more incentive to provide faster and cost-efficient service because their survival depends on consumer sales. Yes, so people have more incentive because their business relies on it and their own livelihood depends on it. Chapter 10 is productivity and pay. So labor is a scarce resource because there's always more work to do than people with time to do it. There's unlimited work and there's a limited amount of people to do all the work. Supply and demand determines pay. To keep this simple, it basically means the more specialized and difficult the job is, the more in demand and the higher the pay is going to be for those fields. Right now, it would be like engineers because we live in a very technological era, or maybe something outlandish like quantum physicists, because nobody is, or very few people are going to be doing that job. So they're high in demand, they're higher pay. On the other side of the spectrum, we would have jobs that are not so specialized and very high in supply, meaning that a lot more people can do the job regardless of the skill set that you have. So like maybe a job working the register or stocker at Walmart. And there's nothing wrong with working these jobs because you have your entire life to increase your skills, your education, and your experience. So if you wanted to move up, it would just take time and effort. And if you don't want to move up the capitalistic and corporate ladder, then that's perfectly fine too. You would just have to put your pride aside and be able to live off of less. So you have a choice: either make more or be able to be satisfied with less. So income is not distributed like stimulus checks. It is earned over time. So when we look at income distribution and we see how warped it is on the side of the hyper rich, it is easy to get emotional or upset because we don't have the other side of the story. In reality, it's quite optimistic. 3/4 of American workers in the bottom 20% in income in 1975 were in the top 40% at some point within the next 16 years. So there is the hope that if you are in a lower income bracket, that you could, with time and experience, move to a higher one. Now, of course, when it comes to people on the very top of the income distribution, those individuals will most likely remain the same, but because of the amount of hours that they are actually working and the amount of time that they are putting into their work. So if you want to be on the top, it takes a lot of sacrifice that many people are not willing to make. So the top 6% of income earners, 62% worked 50 plus hours and 35% worked 60 plus hours a week, which is basically their entire week of working. And the majority of us don't want to work that many hours, let alone 40 hours a week. I guess you can argue this point by saying there are people who aren't making that much that are working 60 plus hours a week as well. It's just the only difference between the people that are working 60 plus hours and are at the top of the income distribution and people who are working 60 plus hours and are at the bottom is the fact that the jobs that they're working are in different demands. So you could be working 60 hours a week in two jobs that has a very high supply of people that can do them. And instead of putting all your time and effort into both those jobs, you can be putting your time into accumulating skills into working less and making more in a more specialized field. All right. Declining numbers of people per household lowers real income per household due to a rise in real per capita income. Rising prosperity decrease household size. This is commenting on the fact that real income per household is lowering. So if you see that, you might think, oh, people are getting poorer. But in reality, the individuals are becoming more prosperous, so they can move out of the households. So the people within the households is declining while the individual prosperity is increasing. The statement, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, is probably something we've all heard at some point within our lives. And the fact that we have all heard it is exactly the reason why it should be open to doubt. Now, the statement itself holds some truth. It is true on the very far extremes of the distribution, on the far poor side and the far rich side. But within the middle portion of it, we can see, based on the points that I've given before, that a majority of the reason why people are poor is just because they are young. With increased skills, increased experience over time, they can move income brackets within the next 5, 10, 20 years. So the myth is that the same people hold the wealth over time. And the fact that it is impossible for people who are on the lower ends to escape to the upper income brackets. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to gender differences, which is quite a volatile subject currently, and maybe possibly within all of time, but we shall try to do so and bring some statistics that may be surprising to you. From 1971, single women who worked continuously from high school till their 30s earned slightly more than men of the same description, which may come as a surprise to you if you believe that women are being oppressed by the patriarchy. Women and men make different occupational choices based on their ability to work. So, women bear children. It is almost a bad point, I would say, but the fact is, men can work longer and they can work continuously, and they are willing to work continuously because they need to provide for their wives or their girlfriends and their children. Now, it's not like women can't do the jobs that men can do. Women are completely capable of doing any job that a man can do. It's just a matter of, one, if they want to do that, and if that should be their highest priority when it comes to values. So, should women value competing against men for higher pay, which is exactly what is incentivized within our society, because it is solely based on the amount of money that you make? Or is it more important for women to raise up the next generation of humanity? Women produce men and women, so socially they are extremely important. And I think raising children is probably a lot more important than getting a higher paycheck than the guy next to you. So we can reduce the complexity of the men versus women for higher salary in society to just a normal man and woman relationship. So if a man and a woman are in a relationship and they're competing with each other, then that relationship will degenerate very, very quickly. Men and women need to communicate and they need to work with each other. So this narrative of oppression by men is not very helpful. You don't want 50% of humanity to be your enemy, when in reality we can all cooperate with each other and see that there are higher things to value than making more money than the next guy. All right, so going back to statistics, women without children earned 95% of what men earned, even when making different occupational choices, and women with children earned 75%. Going back to the point before, because men can work more continuously than these women. And men will take STEM jobs, science, technology, engineering, and math because the fields are rapidly changing and need people to work continuously. So that's why men are in these jobs, because those fields are changing every single week, every single month, every single second. And they need people who can work long hours and cannot stop working. Men also work more hazardous jobs, which pay more. 54% of the workplace is male, but 92% of job-related deaths are too. So it's sad to say, but it is almost as if men are more disposable in the workplace than women. Because let's say you had only men on the planet. The human race would die out very, very quickly. If you had one woman, you can continue our species for generations to come. And aside from that point, men are just more willing to work these hazardous jobs because they have to, in a way. They don't have a choice in the matter, because their value is dependent on their work, not their ability to produce other humans. So women have inherent value just because of that fact. And men, we have value based on what we can provide. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about race. So income is less about race, more about age, skills, and literacy level. Discrimination would cause economic costs to employers. So if you have a minority who is more skilled and can do the job better than, let's say, a white man who is apparently the image of racial oppression in today's day and age, then by the logic, if you're saying they won't hire the minorities and they'll pay the minorities less, so why wouldn't they want to hire the minorities over the white man if they can do the job better and they can pay them less? This is a very long chapter, so bear with me. These are the last 2 points that I'm going to make. In poor countries, labor is cheap and abundant. Capital is expensive. And in rich countries, it's vice versa. So in poor countries that are less industrialized, there's an abundance of people to work. There is just not any businesses there that they can work for. And in rich countries, it's very industrialized, lots of business, lots of industrialization, and which means a lot more specialization when it comes to the labor. So there's less people to do the jobs. Next point, mass production causes lower production costs, so it is cost efficient to replace rather than repair. If you're producing at a very high level it is more cost efficient to replace something rather than repair it, because repairing it would mean that you have to pay for the labor that is specialized. So like a person that is specialized in repairing a piece of machinery is going to cost more than actually just buying a new machine, if that makes any sense. Chapter 11 is minimum wage laws. So Thomas Sowell makes the analogy for higher minimum wage with higher set price floors. So we talked about price floors in a previous chapter. What happens when price is halted from reaching a certain low point? There's more supply in the form of a surplus and less demand. So he says that the same thing happens when it comes to labor. If you set a higher minimum wage, there's surplus labor in the form of unemployment, because it's going to cost more for the employer to hire people if the wages are set higher. It's quite a controversial claim, because setting a higher minimum wage is intended to have the opposite effect, as in looking out for the poorer sex of the labor market. But Sowell argues that it has the exact opposite effect of this and keeps people from getting jobs. So this is the point he makes. Minimum wage does not increase productivity and reduces incentive to hire lower qualified workers. High unemployment for young minorities is not due to less education, lack of skills, or racism, but higher wages imposed by labor unions. That's quite a complicated point, because obviously more education and more skills is going to get you more opportunity, but he just is saying because of these high wages set by labor unions, there are more barriers to entry into the workforce. Higher set wages leads to cutting labor for capital or outsourcing production in countries with cheaper labor. So companies are incurring costs, or they're acquiring more costs from the higher price for labor now. So what they're going to do is they're either going to buy more capital and cut the labor force, or they're going to outsource the labor to countries that are cheaper. Minimum wage laws negatively impact the employment of those who are younger, less experienced, or less skilled, because the pool shrinks and barrier for entry grows. So that's essentially the same point I made before. From the inside looking out, it benefits those with jobs. So those who have minimum wage jobs already are going to benefit from the increase in their pay. But from the people on the outside looking in, it's going to be a lot harder for them to enter the workforce, because there's going to be less demand for labor itself. Chapter 12 is special problems in labor markets. So a very interesting statistic that you guys might be interested in is that the unemployment rate is based on the percentage of people in the labor force that are not working, of course, but they also have to be job searching. So people that haven't been job searching and are also unemployed within the last 4 weeks are not actually counted within the unemployment rate. So about 37% of the American population age 16 and over, I'm reading a statistic right now online, are neither employed or unemployed, but they fall in the category of not in the labor force. So that's more than 92 million Americans that are neither employed or unemployed. So very interesting, because you would think that just people in general who don't have a job would be counted within the unemployment rate, but that is not actually the case. So government programs that give money to unemployed contributes to the stagnation of the unemployment rate, because those people are not counted in the labor force. So funny enough, I am on unemployment right now, so I guess I could be considered part of the problem. But I have been job searching, and I'm probably going to be getting a job very soon, hopefully. And since I am on unemployment, I can give my personal perspective on this. Technically, you're supposed to be searching for a job while you're certifying for your benefits every single week. Like, they ask you questions like, have you gotten a job? How many hours have you worked? And yeah, technically you're supposed to, but they don't necessarily have a way of proving it. So you can just cash out on unemployment every single week until it expires, so to speak. Moving on to working conditions, which is regulation by government and labor unions that include safety laws, child labor laws, and maximum hours of work. So working conditions are constantly in flux, constantly changing based on workers' organizations and employers' organizations and government laws. So collective bargaining is agreement of imposed working conditions or pay for workers. In employer organizations, an example of such would be like the sports organizations of the NBA, the MLB, the NFL, and these are just groups of employers for an industry. So each team is its own employer, and they all work in the same organization. Labor unions are groups of employees who negotiate with their employer. So employees form a labor union, and then they collective bargain and come to an agreement for better working conditions for all the employees within that occupation. And another point is just about occupational licensing. So this is requiring a government issued license to participate in a certain occupation, but it also limits competition in the job market. Yeah, so if you need a specific license, for example, you need a CDL license to drive the trucks for Amazon or FedEx or UPS, and only the people who have those licenses can work in that specific I wouldn't say field, but work in that sector of the company itself. So those people will get paid more just because they have an occupational license. Chapter 13 is on investment. So an investment is sacrificing real things today for more real things in the future. Some examples being art. You put time into creating a work of art with the hope of a return on your piece later on in the future. Your time, when you're working, you put your time and effort with the expectation that you're going to get paid. And money, you invest your finances with the hope that maybe you'll get a greater return in the future, if we're talking maybe specifically about stocks. So human capital, education is also an investment that may or may not pay off for the individual or the economy, because it can be directed towards fields not in demand. I can attest to this because I have a philosophy degree. I love philosophy, but it is very difficult to actually get into a specialized field. But I am not upset about it because the life application for this degree helps me very much, I believe. So financial investment, that's what we said before. Investors will allocate resources to producers in hope of greater production. So a financial investment could be putting money in a stock, or it could be also people putting money into their business with the hope of greater production. So banks and insurance companies are the major investors pooling from capital funded by depositors and stockholders. We will talk about the banks later in a future chapter and expand more upon that point. So borrowers and lenders take future income in the form of credit and interest. Just a fancy way of saying you can use money now, but you got to pay it back later. Countries without institutional investment en masse cannot generate wealth quickly, leading to societal decline and poverty. Basically saying if you can't raise the economy of scale through wide-scale investment, your economy is not likely to thrive to the level that you want it to get to. ROI means return on investment. So it is profit divided by investment, and I forgot to add times 100 so you can get the percentage increase. So let's say you invested $1,000 and you made a $1,200 profit. So it's 1,200 divided by 1,000, which is 1.2, times it by 100, and you get a 120% increase. Low interest rates, more borrowing occurs as it is profitable to invest, and high interest rates is the opposite, less borrowing occurs as it is costly, causing more saving. So if you have a credit card, for example, and you have a high interest rate, the incentive for you is to use less or borrow less or put less on your credit card so that your interest rate will go down. And if the interest rate goes down, then you might have more incentive to be buying with credit at that point. Speculation is the practice of buying goods now in hope of a future return. So having to do with stocks and commodities, things of this sort. Professional speculators who do it as a job or career reduce risk for others through their investment knowledge, and they just are more aware of the market, events that are happening within the market, and all the little intricacies that are going on. So they substitute their own knowledge for a price that you pay for a profit that is more likely to occur. Inventories is a storage as a substitute for knowledge. Inventory could be a bad or a good thing. If you have a small inventory and you're running out of goods, it could cause customers to go elsewhere to your competition. And if you have a large inventory, you could have an excess of goods as well as higher maintenance costs. Present value means that the price today is not reflective of how an asset will rise or fall in the future. So an asset can either appreciate or depreciate. For example, if you make renovations to your home, aka your property, then the asset will appreciate in value. And the housing market in general is generally going to rise in value. So the market itself is good for investment. And on the opposite side, a car is a depreciating asset over the years. as the models get older and older, then the value of the car is going to go down. Also, you're going to be putting miles on it, which depreciates the value. The other example was location. If you are located near a sewage treatment plant, let's say, then this will reduce the value because the location is not as desirable. Present value is also important when determining the cost to explore for natural resources, the example being oil. So oil exploration is extremely costly, but as it becomes scarce and the demand becomes higher, then it becomes more profitable for people to explore for it. On top of this, the technology for extraction is improving as well. So this goes back to the points before about people being alarmist about us running out of oil. It is only in relation to whatever's in current circulation. So oil is scarce when the supply gets low, but then the demand goes higher, and then it increases incentive for people to find more of it. Chapter 14 is stocks, bonds, and insurance. So a bond is a legal commitment to pay fixed amounts of money on a fixed date. It is a debt security issued by the government to support its spending and obligations. So the government, when it needs to borrow money, will issue bonds, and the public will pay a fixed price, right? And there is an end of the term. So at the end of the term, you will get your principal back. So whatever you paid for the bond, you'll get back. And the government will be paying you interest within the span in between that time until the end of the term. I'm going to skip over to the next point real quick because it's related. So bond prices go down as interest rates rise and vice versa. I'm going to leave a link down in the description to give you a visual representation of what this looks like. But very briefly, it just means, let's say you have a $1,000 bond. It has a 3% interest rate. I'm using this from the example in the link. If the interest rate goes up to, let's say, 4%, then the bond price will go down to $900. So you can either choose to keep your $1,000 bond with the 3% interest rate, or you could sell it for a $100 loss and then rebuy it at the $900 price for a 4% interest rate. You just got to do the calculation and see how much you'll get in total over the course of the entire term. So going back to stocks, which are shares of a business that issues them. A bond is a fixed return and a stock is a variable return. So bonds, you're going to know what you're going to get out of it as soon as you get into the deal. And for stocks, that just depends on the success of the business that you're investing in. So if a business does very well, then you'll get a high variable return on your stock. If it doesn't, then you're going to lose money. Venture capital investments. So a venture capitalist is a person who will invest their capital into new businesses with the hope that they're going to get a big return. So if your business is already established, then the return is probably going to be slow over time. So let's say Tesla, Apple, Microsoft, all these are established businesses. So if you invest in them, your stock will make a profit, but it will be a very small margin. So what a venture capitalist will do is look for businesses with potential and invest their money with the hope that they become an established business. Diversification, people will say keep your portfolio diverse, meaning don't put all your eggs in one basket. You need to invest into multiple different things so that if one fails and you lose all the money for that investment, you don't lose all your money overall. Insurance deals with the inherent risk of losses and provides compensation for specified loss, damage, illness, death, in return for a payment of a premium. So, yeah, we're all aware, or when you get older, you're aware that you need to have some sort of health insurance or some sort of car insurance, because the loss is foreseen into the future. So your car is deteriorating, your health will be deteriorating as you get older. So the insurance is just to cover for the possibility that things will go astray. Premiums do not fully cover claims, so companies use holders' money to invest so they could pay the claims and profit. So, yeah, the money you pay up front for insurance is obviously not going to cover for the medical bills or the damage to your car. So the insurance companies have to use these premiums in order to invest into other things so they can actually profit off of them. Government insurance comes in the form of programs such as the National Flood Insurance Program of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, aka FEMA. And Thomas Sell argues that these programs do not reduce risk but incentivize housing in risky areas funded by taxpayers. Free market insurance companies would act with speed while government agencies are slow moving. Example being Hurricane Katrina in 2005, where he discusses how the government did insure this area, but it took them a very long time to get to the scene. And in the case of private insurance companies, Sal argues that if you're in a high-risk area, then there will be higher premiums for the private companies. So the governments will charge lower premiums at the cost of taxpayer money. And if the area was insured by private insurance companies instead of the government, then they would be incentivized to provide service a lot faster. So private insurance companies are a lot faster for one, and they also don't incentivize being located in very high-risk areas. Laws that equalize premiums raises prices for all. So a premium price, or the price you pay up front for insurance, concerns risk. It does not concern fault in individuals or discrimination, which is a misconception within politics. So if you equalize the premiums for everybody, it makes sense, and it seems that it's fair. But what this does is it removes the incentive for cautious behavior, and it increases the incentive for risky behavior. So if the incentive for risky behavior goes up, then the insurance companies will incur more costs, and those costs will get passed on to the individuals that have always been cautious. So they're no longer rewarded for being cautious. Now the people are incentivized to make riskier decisions. Chapter 15 is special problems of time and risk. So uncertainty is a principle that affects all of us in our day-to-day lives. The only thing we can do is become more informed so we don't have to be as anxious about the future. That's one thing I've noticed, is that perhaps people are a little bit nervous to acquire new information or step outside their box of belief, let's say. But I think it makes you more grounded. It gives you more confidence, and it allows you to see things in many different lights. So that's my opinion. And in the market, it concerns stocks. Like, we don't know if stocks are going to rise, if they're going to fall. So there's that degree of uncertainty. And with insurance, we don't know if bad events are going to happen to us in the future. So we use that as a means to stave off those negative outcomes. Risk is calculable, but uncertainty is not. It can cause investors and consumers to be reluctant to spend money, right? Which adversely affects the economy and its recovery. Time and money. The more time something will take, the more money it will cost as well. Whoever has the ability to delay has the ability to impose costs on others. So the market's in constant flux. It's constantly changing. Constantly more innovation is occurring, and new things are being created. Markets are going up and down, and if you work, you know that your work is in exchange. Your work is being rewarded by money in exchange for your time. So the expression "time is money" is a truism, because it is literally, the more time you have, the more money you can make. And if you can do things in a shorter amount of time and you're more efficient, then you'll be rewarded with more money. And that's how things go within business. So economic adjustments, with time comes risk because of lack of foresight. So insurance and speculation are used to offset the risk, right? So insurance companies are used to ward off your worry, I guess, about the future. And speculation, people will invest their money into people who have more knowledge of how markets will move in the future. Politicians seek to increase the benefits in the present to gain election, but displace the cost to the future. The costs are blamed on their successors, because that is when the consequences arise. So this is a funny thing. Like, you could probably notice this if conversations ever get political. Like, if you have a Republican president, and then you have a Democratic president in America. Then when the Democratic president is in office and there's all these problems arising, obviously, like, the Republican Party is going to be like, look, Biden sucks. But the Democratic Party is going to be like, look at all the problems Trump left for us. So you can never win in politics. Mainly, politicians are orators. They're figureheads meant to assure the public. So there's a whole lot of different systems working underneath the surface. So the economic system works with the political system in tandem. It does not necessarily mean that everything that the politicians say is actually going to have the outcomes that we want within the economy. Government program to help children with learning disabilities incentivized behaviors detrimental to the policy. We're getting a little controversial here, and this point's a little bit random, but Thomas Sowell did talk about this within this chapter. So he says that low-income welfare recipients had children do poorly on their tests so they could receive money through the programs. So to some people, they'll be like, of course, that makes sense. Like, if you want to get money out of the government, then this is a easy way to do it. A lot of people may even say that's a smart way of doing it. And then other people will be like, no, there's no way that people could be that morally reprehensible. And yeah, it does sound like the truth, because if you have a low income, the chances that you will engage in behaviors that are more incentivized towards your own benefit rises exponentially. And it could even lead to criminality. So if you're in a low enough state or in a low enough income, then the rules for how you acquire resource go out the window, in my estimation. Chapter 16 is national output. So the fallacy of composition is something that applies to the economy on a national scale, and it is also a principle of logic, and it states what applies to a part does not automatically apply to the whole. In logic, it is talking about inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning is when you have a set of empirical observations that you know to be true. And based on that set of observations, you come to a general conclusion or theory based on that. So for example, you look in your bag and you pull out a penny. And you look in your bag again, you pull out another penny. Look in your bag again, you pull out another penny. So you have 3 instances where all the coins in your bag were pennies. So the general conclusion is that every single coin in your bag is a penny. The problem with this is it's still only an assumption and a theory, so it is not true, but based on your experiences, it is implied to be true. So this is the fallacy. In the 1990s, there was reported massive reductions in employment in American firms, but the unemployment level was the lowest it has been due to the number of jobs nationwide rising. Saving jobs in one failing market may cost another. So, on the first point, this is a problem of news reporting prioritization, meaning that if we see the news and it's reporting on tens of thousands of jobs being lost within these specific firms, it does not speak to the level of nationwide prosperity that is occurring simultaneously. So while in these specific cases that are being reported on because of the importance of these firms, so to speak, within the news, people can get caught up in thinking that this applies to the entire country as a whole, which it did not, according to statistics. The concept of saving jobs is another example of this fallacy, and it's just when the government goes into a specific market that is failing and they subsidize them so that the people in that market will not lose their jobs. So this is the reasoning for saving jobs. The problem is that it always comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of government resources, and there's also no guarantee that a business that was already on the road to failing is not going to continue down that path even with government subsidization. Moving on to output and demand. So Thomas Sowell brings up a problem which states that the growing output that the economy is producing will exceed the purchasing power of the individuals to buy up everything within production. The problem with this is that they were going off of income of the people and not real income. So real income is measured by what money can buy in real goods and services. So whatever is bought up is whatever the producers make. And whatever the producers make is however much production is going to go filter back into the level of output within the economy. I hope that makes sense. So total real income equals total national output. It is impossible to produce more than is sold. Whatever is sold is going to be filtered back into what is produced. So a lack of desire or fear of spending money during the Great Depression caused lower aggregate or total money output into the economy. Less output equals less aggregate demand, which equals more unemployment. So let's go through this real quick. The economy needs money to function. It needs people spending money so that the producers can produce output. If this is not occurring, then, or if the public is getting fearful about spending their money, then the level of production is going to lower. And then when the level of production lowers, they're going to need less labor for the lowered level of production, which will cause people to become unemployed, which will all spiral downward into a depressed economy. GDP and GNP are metrics for the national output that a country produces. So the GDP, the gross domestic product, is the sum total of everything produced in a nation's borders. This includes foreign production by, let's say you're in the U.S. This includes companies that are within the U.S. but may have their origin in other countries as well. So everything within the nation's borders, domestic and foreign, and the GNP, gross national product, is the total of goods and services produced by a nation's people, wherever they may be, wherever their resources be located. So any companies that are U.S. owned, they could be outside of the country and they will still be counted within the GNP. Currently, we use GDP as our national metric, but the difference between the two is very minuscule and irrelevant almost. So it doesn't matter which metric you're using, but that is the slight distinction between them. So along with this, there's also a changing composition of output. So quantitative and qualitative values constantly changing, tech improving, and this just means that the market is in constant flux. There are businesses thriving, there are businesses failing, and there's new technology arising, there's new machinery arising, replacing labor, and just it's a constant changing system that is reflective within the GDP of a country. The Consumer Price Index is a collection of items used to determine the cost of living. So, items that the general population can get their hands on. And we see the prices of different items changing all the time through their ability to be mass produced. And a good example of this is with video cassette recorders. So originally they were priced at $30,000 each, which is ridiculous. But they fell below $200 many years later and were used in the Consumer Price Index. I guess with the amount of people that obtain them, or just the lack of demand in the high pricing, has led them to drop and then become a part of the general cost of living. Declining real wages. So what real wages are the amount of goods and services that you can buy with your income, or the level of purchasing power that you have, is reported to be declining, but oftentimes higher prices reflect an increase in quality and inflation. So higher quality and higher prices come with the resulting decrease in purchasing power. Along with this, the average consumption for Americans and their net worth actually doubled. So the amount of goods and services that are purchased has doubled, and this is not reflective in just seeing real wages declining on paper. International comparisons are difficult to make due to the value of currency as well as goods that are valued by money to be included in the national output. This one's pretty self-explanatory. If you're in a different country, you will have a different currency and a level of purchasing power. $1 will equal 17 pesos. A dollar will also equal 144 yen. So, along with this, the cost of living and the level of production you'll get within each country is going to be different. So the general, the items that are in the general cost of living are going to vary as well. Infant mortality rates decrease in poor countries as prosperity increases. So does the population or the poorer sex as a whole. This can seem like stagnation, averaging the country's real income lower. So basically, as more babies survive, more the population grows, and more people can be included within the economic statistics. So there are a lot of people that are so poor and do not work or live off the land that they're not included within the economy. As countries become more prosperous, then more people are included within the statistics, and as a result of this, there are more people that are going to be clumped up on the poorer section of the economy. Chapter 17 is money and the banking system. So, what is money? We all want it, we all need it, but what is it? Money is an agreed upon intermediary for exchanging anything between people. We used to have a barter system, which is trading one good for another good, but it is slow moving and inefficient because it is difficult to determine value in relation of one good to another. Try exchanging apples for a chair. It would probably be very difficult to do. Is a chair worth 5 apples? Is it worth 1 apple? Is it worth 30 apples? This is what money does for us. So we've been talking about inflation a little bit, which is a rise in prices because there is more demanded than supplied at a given price. This happens when people are spending more money or there's more money in circulation. So if there's more money and people are consuming more than what is being supplied, then the producers and the ones that are selling us the products will have to raise their prices to adjust to the amount of spending that is occurring. The gold standard does not give money intrinsic value, but limits paper money to the supply of gold. Demand for gold changes due to inflation. Higher inflation equals higher gold prices. So what the gold standard did was it limited the power of government to print money by fiat. So let me give you an example. If there is $1,000 in the total money supply, and an ounce of gold is worth $20 per ounce, so there's 50 total ounces of gold in an $1,000 total of paper money. So if the government prints money needlessly and doubles the amount of paper money to, let's say, 2,000, right, there's still 50 ounces of gold. So those 50 ounces of gold are going to rise in price to $40 per ounce because the money is not gaining any actual purchasing power. because the gold is backing it. The money is actually losing purchasing power, and it is costing more to buy up that gold. Stability lowers gold prices because of compounding interest and dividends from other assets. So when the economy is stable, there's less incentive to purchase assets such as gold or real estate that are that have a benefit when there is inflation. So when there's more money in circulation, more money gets printed, there's more inflation, and also this is when the price of gold rises. Inflation is a subtle tax that lowers consumer purchasing power. It is a tax that is underneath the surface that we all know very well, but we may not necessarily regard it as a tax, but it is technically taking our money. The rich hold assets that rise in value with inflation. Stocks, real estate, and gold under the gold standard, and they do this to escape taxes on their money legally. Precious metals were used less, so gold and silver was taken out of the production of coins. What this did was allow more money to be brought into circulation. But as you know, with more money and with more money in circulation, there is more inflation, and with more inflation, this would cause the price of the precious metals themselves to increase. On the other side of the coin, we have deflation, which is falling prices due to a reduction of economic output or a reduction in the amount of spending that occurs. What this does is it causes creditors and debtors to default because debts stay the same while production drops. So less people buying stuff, there's less demand, and there is more supply. And then as a result of this, there is less production that is able to occur, and the debts stay the same, and they are not able to be paid off. So then the debtors default. An example of this that we talked about in a previous chapter was the production of farmers being lowered and their debts remaining the same due to a lack of spending or people to buy up their products. And deflation causes people to save more money, snowballing further deflation. So it's just one big spiral to a depression. Final point on deflation: increasing the money supply would not help deflation because there's not a shortage of money, but output, which means less production and more unemployment. So what we need is not more money in circulation, but we need the current money in circulation to be spent. Moving on to the banks. What banks do is insure the money of private and public entities at a lower cost. Banks raise the economies of scale by using depositor money and interest through credit to increase total money in circulation. So there's two features of modern banking. One, holding a fraction of reserves needed to cover deposits, which is called fractional reserve banking. And two, adding to the total money supply, raising the economy of scale. Fractional reserve banking is when banks credit each other to settle differences between depositors, which allow them to keep only a fraction of deposits in cash. Thomas Sowell gives this example, but I'm going to change the names up a bit. Chase Bank receives deposits of $1 million total from TD Bank. TD Bank receives $1,200,000 from Chase. Chase would only have to pay the difference of $200,000. The reason being is because that million is canceled out because the banks are crediting each other. So a bank's assets cannot all be liquidated at a moment's notice. Liquid meaning assets that can be exchanged easily for cash. So if a person has a lot of money in the bank, they cannot all be liquidated because the bank only has a fraction of their deposits in cash. So this is why when there's a depression or a panic and people are mass withdrawing money, that the banks collapse. So what happens when a bank collapses and all the money that the people deposited into those banks gets lost? Well, the government created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to reimburse depositors whose money was in one of these insured banks when it collapsed. I think that the underlying problem with depositor insurance is the fact that the money that they are going to be printing is going to inevitably be taking away purchasing power from the very individuals that they are reimbursing. So we're using citizens' money to pay off or repay the lost money from the banks. All right. So the FDIC is an institution created by the government to cover deposits when the banks fail. Along with this, there's also the Federal Reserve System, which is a central bank run by the government to control all the private banks. Control meaning set all the rules and regulations that the private banks have to adhere to. Another question for you guys is, if the Federal Reserve controls what the private banks can do, who controls what the Federal Reserve can do? Who regulates the Federal Reserve? I looked it up online, and the Federal Reserve is run by a board of governors. 7 people run this system. 7. That's it. And they're nominated by the president and confirmed in their positions by the Senate. Well, anyway, this is the problem with control. If you control one thing, who's going to control the controller? And then who's going to control the controller of the controlled? Now, I'm not anti-government by any means. I believe that there are problems with whatever decision is made. So, in the case of the FDIC, the government can either, one, insure the people with the taxpayer money of the citizens, or 2, have anarchy and riots in the streets. So it's really just choosing the lesser of 2 evils type of scenario at that point. So what the Federal Reserve does also is controls what fraction of deposits must be kept in reserve, with only the remainder being allowed to be lent out. It also lends to the banks, which the banks re-lend to the public. So the Federal Reserve sets the interest rates for the private banks, which indirectly sets the interest rates for people that are getting money from the private ones. Chapter 18 is government functions. So, along with the possible negative aspects of government, the positive side is that it provides law and order, which is foundational to prevent corruption in economic affairs. So, bribery, nepotism in education, people taking bribes to further their political status or their educational position or opportunities, and nepotism favoring people for hire or again for status or position. And it says, but bureaucratic red tape can also be constraining, which we are well aware of already because we more so have been talking about the negative aspects of what the government is about. Property rights create self-monitoring. I made a typo here, so it's not rationing, it's self-monitoring and incentive for individuals. If an individual owns their labor or their work, there is 100% more incentive for them to provide the highest quality possible. So there's a very interesting lecture series on YouTube titled Justice, taught by Michael Sandel, and it goes a little bit more into property rights and the philosophical aspects of how they come about. So if you want to check that out, go ahead. It's very interesting. So social order involves honesty, reliability, and cooperativeness. Morality plays a functional role in the operation of the economic system. Quote Kenneth Arrow. Laws are what create incentive for moral or immoral conduct. So we listed a couple examples in the previous chapters, including the one of programs for children with disabilities, and this will incentivize behavior of the parents to tell the children to purposefully flunk the exams so they can get the government benefits. So this is just one example. I'm pretty sure we named a couple others, but this is the point that certain laws incentivize certain behaviors, whether that be good or bad. Contrary to popular belief, all economic transactions rely on the consent of both parties. The economy is not a amalgam of zero-sum transactions where one person loses and another person gains. When you go to your local pizzeria and you buy a whole pie, yes, the person who owns that pizzeria is gaining profit and money, but you are gaining the satisfaction of enjoying that pie. So if you're valuing money over the pleasure of experiencing that pizza, then yeah, you can phrase it in a way where you say you're the one that's losing out. An externality is an external cost or benefit caused by a producer that is not financially incurred or received by that entity. Government is best when dealing with the externalities of the economy. So there are certain things that should be dealt by the free market, and there are things that should be handled by the government. An example of what should be handled by the government is military defense. We do not have to purchase military defense individually through the market. If we did, then there'd be great disparities in the level of protection that each individual can have. The main political incentive is popular action, even if the result of that action is worse than no action. Policy can alleviate external costs, but the aggregate costs of policies could strain the economy at large. So there's always this balance between which laws are serving us and which laws are constraining us. And this is why we need a functioning system where people can scrutinize these laws and determine which ones are good for the benefit of everyone as a whole. Chapter 19 is government finance. So the national debt is a definite point of interest for anybody within their respective country. And it is the accumulation of the government budget deficits over time. If all government spending is paid for with money received in taxes, then the budget is balanced. So if the government receives less money in taxes than it spends, then there will be a budget deficit. And the budget deficits that accumulate over the years adds to the national debt. Question is, should we be worried about the national debt? The short answer is no, not necessarily, because if we're looking at it just by itself as a statistic, let's say in the U.S. it's $30 trillion of debt. We have to remember that we also have to take account of the debt owed to us by other countries, and we also have to take into account the national GDP, because if the production level of the U.S. is close to the level of the national debt, then the deficit is not as bad and we can manage it and then make amends to keep it at bay. Most government revenues come from taxes, bonds, as we've talked about in a previous chapter, and the services that they provide. Higher tax rates do not always equal higher revenues. Alternatives can get bought or people leave tax residencies. As we have said before, when the government makes decisions and they decide to implement higher taxation, they have to take into account that the people will change their behavior. So if you lower tax rates, it could incentivize people to pour more money into the economy, which will increase production, which will inevitably increase the overall GDP of the country. In other words, lower tax rates allow consumers to expand investments. Couple definitions here. A regressive tax is one that takes a higher percentage from people with lower incomes than higher incomes, and a progressive tax is the opposite, one that takes more money from people of higher incomes than lower ones. Bonds we went over in a previous chapter, so we don't need to go over that. The goods and services that the government provides, examples being national parks, tolls, mail, public transportation, including trains and buses. Government prices for goods and services may be artificially cheaper because of subsidization from tax revenues, so the actual cost is greater. Basically saying that we are paying for the government services with our taxes, so the fact that they are cheaper is just a result of the money that is coming from our pockets. And budgets are projections, not records of future revenue and spending. So it is difficult for anybody to accurately estimate how much the government is going to spend or needs to spend based on however the people in office feel necessary. And also, it is impossible to know how much revenue the market is going to bring in because it is ever expanding. So the budgets are just projections, and so they can manage the debt in a way, or try to keep at that level so that it doesn't get out of hand. Tax revenues from the rich increase when their tax rates were cut. Tax cuts for the rich. So when we say regressive and progressive tax, obviously the progressive tax, where the higher incomes are taxed more, sounds like it's more favorable. But Sal argues that the revenues from the rich increased when the tax rates were cut, most likely because they were able to pool their money back into the economy, which, like I said before, will increase the overall production and GDP of the country as a whole. So assumptions of results do not account for change in spending behaviors. All right. Chapter 20 is special problems in the national economy. So I'm going to go through this chapter fairly quickly because it's just going to reiterate the point that Thomas Sowell continually makes throughout the book, which is the difference between how politics work and how economics work. Economics is very cause and effect. It's based on decisions and the consequences as such. And politics is more so about taking action and deciding, what is best to do, regardless of whatever effect that it may have on the economy, whether it be good or bad. So the scope of government and economics will always overlap. It is necessary not only to decide which particular outcome would be preferred, but also which process offers the best prospect of actually reaching that outcome. Politics incentivize governments to create change. So politics must always, in a sense, do something or create a policy, because then it may seem like, what is the government actually doing? But just because they always take action and always say this is for the good of society, it does not always happen as they say or how they would like it to unfold. Government spent large tax revenues during the Great Depression to intervene in the economy, which led to massive unemployment and further recession. On the other side of the coin, the Reagan administration had no reaction when the stock market crashed in 1987, which led to the market recovering on its own with a 20-year expanse of steady growth and inflation. So this is just an example advocating for the no action over action with negative consequence. Moving on to government obligations, some questions or food for thought. Should the government compensate for unemployment? Should they loan money out and not expect repayment in times of crisis? How should government provide pension plans? And pensions for retirees are paid for by the current generation. This is what Social Security is. So your tax money right now is going to the previous generations that are currently retiring. The birth rate and life expectancy are predictors of current generations' ability to pay past pensions. Right, so the birth rate decline results in larger retiring class than working class. So in these cases, pensions will be unable to be paid. So even though your pensions are promised based on the birth rate and the life expectancy of the population, it may not always come to fruition. So just be aware of that and do not get upset when your expectations are not met at the end of your career. You shouldn't be necessarily worried about whether or not the government will pay your pension, but the point being that there is always a market failure and government failure in whatever era that you are living in. So it is important to just not have your expectations too high so you don't get blindsided by something that you do not necessarily like. So the imperfections of the marketplace have led many to see government interventions as necessary and beneficial, yet the imperfections of the market must be weighed against the imperfections of the government whose interventions are prescribed. Yeah, so within every situation, we must analyze first and make decisions later instead of just being alarmist and making decisions very quickly. Okay, so now we're getting into the international economy with Chapter 21, which is international trade. The North American Free Trade Agreement, aka NAFTA, was enacted in 1994 and established a free trade zone in North America between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. So basically it opened the borders and removed the barriers for trade. Predictions of jobs being lost to Mexico because of the country's lower wage rates were wrong. The U.S. and Mexico had increases by the millions in new jobs, and unemployment in U.S. and Canada shot down sharply. So why was this the case? Well, for one, there is no fixed supply of jobs. Jobs get created as the economy grows. So opening the borders to Mexico and Canada increased the economy of scale, And due to this, it increased the production and then increased the amount of jobs available. Adam Smith, within his Wealth of Nations, determined that real wealth consists of goods and services, not the gold supply. So when a country has an absolute advantage, this is when they can produce goods and services cheaper or better than its trading partners. An absolute advantage is isolated to one specific good, so tropical fruits in countries with tropical climates. In those specific countries, they have an absolute advantage because it is a lot easier to produce it based on their geographical location. A comparative advantage, on the other hand, is something that you're determining between two countries and where they should specialize their labor. So this is when countries can produce certain products more efficiently, allowing them to trade those lower costs for greater overall output. Producing everything has opportunity costs. So even if a country has an absolute advantage within two goods or two domains, if they focus all their workers into one good and the other country focuses all their workers into the other good, they're going to be able to produce a greater overall output than if the country just by itself produced both goods. I don't know if this is confusing or I'm just not explaining it well, but I'm going to try to give you an example. So comparative advantage is all about opportunity cost of where your labor should go, and absolute advantage is more so about the efficiency of producing a certain product. So even if the US, let's say, has an absolute advantage in producing chairs and sofas, we're going to use the US and Canada. So if the US has an absolute advantage and they can produce both things more efficiently than Canada can produce chairs and sofas, but Canada comes close to the level of production within chairs, but not very close within the level of production for sofas. Let's say if the US allocated all its labor to the production of sofas, and since Canada is close to the level of production of chairs, it allocated all its resources towards the production of chairs. That combined output between the two would be greater than if both countries just produced everything domestically. So if the US produced chairs and sofas, and if Canada produced chairs and sofas on their own, it would be less than if the US allocated all their workers to sofas and Canada allocated all their workers to chairs. And this is how they have a greater economy of scale. The high wage fallacy is the fact that high wages do not equal high labor costs. There's more output in higher wage industries because costs are lower than lower wage industries producing domestically. So that's the benefit of efficiency. If you're producing products more efficiently, then you can afford to pay your workers higher wages. And also, we've talked about pay in a previous chapter. Mainly, pay is determined by supply and demand of the specialized field. If there is a low supply and a low amount of people that could do the job, the pay is going to be higher because the industry itself is more lucrative. Trade restrictions for national defense are viable and agreed upon by economics and politicians alike. So, obviously, when there's war going on, there's going to be restrictions on trade. You're not going to want to trade with the people that you're at war with because you want to use all your resources to win that war. Pretty self-explanatory. Dumping is when foreign producers sell products for cheap in other countries to take over the market and raise prices later. Tomasello says this is a fallacy and is not true, but if it were true, businesses would be producing under costs, which would cause them to fail. So people claim that, for example, when multinational corporations go to third world countries and they can sell their products for much cheaper, they do this to gain a monopoly on the market and then force the domestic producers out of business. The fact of the matter is this is simply not true. The corporations are able to produce at a cheaper level because of the level of greater efficiency. Now, whether or not the domestic producers actually do go out of business or not is not a matter of dumping. So it is not a matter of them intentionally going and having their products sell for cheaper just to put those companies out of business. If that is a second-hand effect, then that is just the reality of the economic market. Tariffs are taxes on imports, so goods coming into your country. And they are meant to protect domestic producers, but shrink the scale of overall exports and imports. So tariffs have the intention of raising the prices of the goods coming into the country so that the country, within the country, the goods have a advantage of selling over the ones that are imported. The problem with this is that it lowers the overall economy of scale and is a negative for both sides of the trade. So same deal with the import quota, which is a trade restriction that sets a physical limit on the quantity of a good that can be imported into a country in a given period of time. So if you set a restriction, then this is obviously going to restrict the scale or the level that the combined economy can reach. Outsourcing is a transfer of jobs to foreign countries. If the labor is cheaper within a different country, then they are going to outsource jobs over there so they can do the job at the same level of productivity for cheaper. International trade is counted only in goods, not services. U.S. imports more goods, exports more services. So if it looks like there's an unequal balance of trade and the U.S. is actually importing more goods than it is exporting, the services are not included within that marker. So it is difficult to determine how much is going in and how much is going out. Chapter 22 is international transfers of wealth. So in 2012, the worldwide total of $21 trillion of international bank loans, $2.5 trillion of this went to poorer countries, less than 12%. $6 trillion in international investment securities, less than $400 billion went to poor countries, which is less than 7%. Why was this so? Rich countries tend to invest in other rich countries. Poor countries tend to be less stable, more corrupt, with more government control on the economy, so returns on investment are not guaranteed. Remember, the economy is run by the honesty and reliability and stability of and cooperation of the public and the free market and the transactions that are made. So if there's a lot of corruption and the government is trying to protect its domestic producers, then this will not allow foreign investment and corporations to come in and raise the economy of scale of the country as a whole. The logic in itself is faulty because they believe that those foreign corporations that are coming in are going to be taking business away from the domestic producers, which in a sense would be taking power away from the country as a whole. The problem with this is that those foreign investors and those multinational corporations actually have more incentive to just go and do business in the richer countries. So this is the problem. Economic transactions are not zero sum. We've stated this point a couple times already. And creditor and debtor nations are not intrinsically good or bad. We've talked about this when we went over the national debt. Remittances are money sent from immigrants working in foreign countries back to their families. So, real quick, an immigrant is someone who is coming from their country of origin. So, leaving from their country of origin. An immigrant is one who is going into a new country. So, technically, a person can be both an immigrant and a immigrant. It is just a difference of phrasing when you're talking about what action is occurring. Foreign aid represents only a small fraction of money sent to developing nations. So foreign aid being money from one government to another. The majority being philanthropy or charity, just donations given. Private capital, this is investment. And remittances, people that immigrate into a new country and send money back to their homelands. So human capital is a main factor of economic production. Entire industries have been transformed by immigrants. German beer breweries in the U.S., for one. I could think of another example. Any Chinese food spot you go to in the U.S. is owned by Chinese people that are most likely immigrants that have changed the way you consume food or give you another option. So this is just one way that immigrants contribute to the overall economy. When you're talking about strong versus a weak currency, this is their value in regard to the purchasing power when exchanged with other currencies. A rise of currency value raises export prices, which reduces imports from other countries. So this is actually a negative of having a strong currency, is the fact that other countries will import less from you. So having a strong currency isn't always a good thing. When it is a good thing, it is when you have more purchasing power when you're exchanging. So when it comes to international buys or paying debt to countries with weaker currency, I gave some examples here. Euros in Europe, yen in Asia, the krona in Sweden, the franc in Switzerland, pounds in Britain, and we talked about pesos in Mexico and parts of South America as well. Chapter 23 is international disparities in wealth. So I'm not going to explain too much within this chapter because they're mainly just facts about how economies prosper. So the first one being geographic. There are several factors that can affect a country's prosperity, including soil makeup for farmland, water access for transport and trade, mountains affecting weather and isolation, and availability of animals for food and production. If you go way back, if you remember in your early history classes, we first learned about the ancient river valley civilizations. So all these civilizations prospered because they were near a source of water. So land transport is far more expensive than water transport. There's less fuel used and far more capacity by sea. Social isolation deprives economic progress and new ideas from being integrated. Mountains can provide irrigation for lowlands, for farming. Horses and oxen, heavy-duty beasts of burden, developed early land transportation. There's also cultures, law and order, as we've talked about, and attitudes towards work and economic development, language differences, and tribalism. Tribalism having to do with social isolation as well. You can isolate yourself within your group, and if you do so, you will have a strong community connection, but you will also constrain yourself from integrating new ideas and possibly innovation that will make you more prosperous. The last point being Western European languages developed written forms centuries before Eastern Europe did. Education was highly tuned towards the dominant written language. And if education was tuned toward the dominant written language, then economic prosperity is also tuned towards that as well. Cultural minority being blamed for disparities in the domestic ethnic societies is a phenomenon with economic consequences. So this is just a fancy way of talking about tribalism, and in the example that I've made before about third world countries protecting their domestic producers with the fear that foreign multinational corporations would come in and take business from them. In the same way of economy, people are also fearful of the ideas of people that they are not aware of or do not know what their intentions are, which 100% makes sense in the BC world when people were killing each other for gold and pillaging villages and all of that. While overpopulation is a conceived issue, population density has little to do with making a country rich or poor. Productivity within the population is a more accurate marker. So real quick on overpopulation, a lot of people think that we have a overpopulation problem, and this is mainly due to the climate change narrative that our increasing population is causing an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. The reality of things is that we are on the verge of population collapse because of the fall of the nuclear family and also the introduction of various forms of contraception within the last 50 years. So these are things we have to be aware about for the future. It may seem counterintuitive because it appears on the surface that women are becoming more promiscuous, but they are more promiscuous but having less children and focusing more on themselves and their career instead of having children and starting a family. So this is what's happening, and this is what's leading to a eventual population decline. Moving on to imperialism. So imperialism is what I've said before, like going in and taking over the land by force. So imperialism brought gold and silver to the home country of Spain, but little economic and educational development. The gold and silver were quickly drained for imports and military expenditures in the Spanish Empire. War, disease, and enslavement spread by imperialism were synonymous with economic disparity. So it's not very difficult to understand. The empires were focused on imperialism. They were focused on pillaging and raising the wealth of their empire rather than raising the education and prosperity of their people. They are more concerned about power than they were about prosperity. We are in the last section and the home stretch. This is mostly just going to be review about everything we've gone over so far. So if you guys made it up to this point, thank you for sticking with me. Chapter 24 is myths about markets. Markets are not a thing. They are made up of people. Prices are not controlled. Sellers must adapt to competition and the laws of supply and demand. Brand names provide expectation of a certain quality and are not just a way of getting customers to pay more for their products. Brands hold producers to a higher standard. Non-profit organizations' lack of competition can lead them astray from their ostensible or outlined goals. Campuses contract out portions of their operations to profit-seeking companies who can lower costs and increase quality and use. Bookstores, dining halls. Reliance on donations requires people to be alarmist. So this is all a defense of the free market and private institutions and of the American dream, in a sense, because this narrative of oppression by the rich is holding you back. It's holding you back. Honestly, if you believe that idea, you will never get to where you want to go, and you will hold a lot of resentment towards people that have what you do not. But you got to ask yourself the question, like, why do you want these things in the first place? Are you willing to put in the work to actually get them? Are you driven to actually get them? If you're not, then why even hold the idea? You know, like it doesn't serve you in any way. You are benefiting from the products of the market and the individuals that hold a majority of the wealth. In no way are they oppressing you. They bring you all the products that you have, and that you hold, and that you use, that you can use to your own benefit to even get to the level that they're at too. But instead, you choose to be oppressed. It is all you. Chapter 25 is non-economic values. So economics is not a value in itself. It is a method of weighing one value against another, much like morality. Growth of wealth actually saves lives as opposed to rhetoric. So a growing economy is doing more for the poor sector of society than politicians saying this is what we're going to do. But we have to look at the consequences as well if we're thinking economically. Idealistic values involving a villain, preventing privatization of utilities. Politics works through narrative. It works through having a villain and a hero. They say, I am the hero that you need, and that's the villain over there. So if you believe in that, then you may believe that you're being oppressed by these villainous and demonic forces of society. But you forget that you're also benefiting from it. Luxuries have become commonplace due to privatization and economies of scale. The personal morality of an individual will represent their subsidized values. Privileges come at others' expense. Achievements add to others' benefit. It's a matter of semantics, the words that you use. If you say those individuals are privileged, they're benefiting at my expense. Or you could say, look at the great achievements they have made for the human race. I am also benefiting from that. Chapter 26 is the history of economics. Thomas Sowell decided to put this at the end of his book, but I saw someone comment, I'm not sure where, in a review or something, that this chapter should have been at the beginning of the book. Either way, I guess it's important to have a little bit of historical context when it comes to newly arising economic ideas. So the mercantilists in the 15th 1600s to the 1700s promoted more exports than imports to acquire more gold. So this is where the idea of more exports being a favorable balance of trade comes from. They were more focused on the power of the nation over promoting slavery and imperialism. So they were the first to separate these two ideas. We don't need to take people's gold by force. We can trade more so we can acquire more gold and increase the power of our nation. Then came classical economics with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, which promoted goods and services over gold. He also was the diametric opposition to the mercantilists and focused on laissez-faire and free markets. So he was the first to introduce the concept of separating the markets from government, and he was more focused on the creation of wealth as a whole, as opposed to one person or one government benefiting at the expense of another. David Ricardo developed the ideas of comparative advantage and supply and demand, which we both talked about. And there's Say's law, which states supply creates its own demand. Aggregate demand has no limit. So this was the answer to the growing output problem of having the capacity to exceed the ability to buy it. Whatever is in supply is going to be in ratio to the demand. The amount in supply cannot outweigh the demand. So whatever is demanded is going to be bought. And then whatever is going to be bought is going to be filtered back into the production and the supply. So the marginalist revolution divided classical and modern economics by proposing a theory that asserts individuals make decisions on the margin. What this did was shift the focus from the cost of producers to the demands of the consumers. So it stated that consumers make decision on the margin, which means that they make incremental choices depending on the cost-benefit ratio of buying that product. I'll use the example of a gallon of milk. So milk expires fairly quickly. The marginal utility grows as you buy a couple gallons of milk. But if you buy too many gallons, then it's possible that the excess will expire. So this is the concept of margin. Along came Carl Menger and William Stanley Jevons, who proposed that utility is entirely subjective. So the incremental utility varies from individual to individual, and then when you add up all the demands of the individual consumers, this will give you the entire demand of society, which will determine the supply produced, and this is what gives you the overall economy. Alfred Marshall, in his Principles of Economics in 1890, stated it was a combination of supply and demand which determined pricing, as we know to be true. Then there was equilibrium theory, which states no equilibrium exists in actuality, so understanding it really is figuring out why things are in flux to restore a steady state. Things are in constant flux, but we must figure out why. And then based on looking at things in retrospect, we can determine a path toward the future. Keynesian economics, coined by John Maynard Keynes, argued that government intervention and policy could manage recessions with little side effects. Post-Keynesian economics found the market more rational and more responsive than the Keynesians had assumed, and the government less so. Economics is a science that cannot be tested in a controlled setting, much like many other sciences, but by analyzing the historical implications of the market and government. So we can learn by looking in retrospect the consequences of how the market moves or how the government makes decisions and what inevitably comes from that. Theories can be made and affirmed by future decisions and events. You can make theories by gathering data from the past, and they will be affirmed by the future events that occur. This is the last chapter, chapter 27, Parting Thoughts. So, if there's anything that you could take away from this entire presentation, it's going to be these 3 points. Many economic fallacies depend upon 1. Thinking of the economy as a set of zero-sum transactions, where one party gains and another party loses. 2. Ignoring the role of competition in the marketplace and pricing. So pricing is not determined by fiat or authoritative decree. It is determined upon competition and supply and demand. And 3. Not thinking beyond the initial consequences of particular policies. So politicians will say, I'm doing this, this, and that, and whoever is within that party will say, oh, great, this is going to be perfect for us. Look at how great of a president this such and such is. But then we lose interest and forget to analyze the economic consequences that come after. So, if anything, just know that there's a difference between politics and economics, even though they are inevitably intertwined with each other. So that's it, guys. Thank you all for watching. If you have sticked with me this long, I salute you, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.